60 hours. That's how long a 20-year-old sat in an interrogation room being told a lie so convincing that he eventually believed it himself. A lie that put him in prison for 2 decades while the real killer lived 4 houses away. This is the case everyone thinks they understand. They don't. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers cold cases and murder investigations where one decision created decades of consequences. Subscribe now so you don't miss how this one ends. Idaho Falls, Idaho. A city of about 65,000 people wrapped around the Snake River, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name and front doors rarely got locked. It was not a city that expected murder investigations. It got one anyway in the summer of 1996. Angie Dodge was 18 years old. The youngest of 4 children and the only daughter, she grew up moving from base to base with a Navy father, which meant constantly starting over, new school, new town, new group of strangers to win over. Instead of breaking her, it built something in her, the ability to walk into any room and make people feel like they'd known her for years. By the time her family settled permanently in Idaho Falls, Angie had found her group, a loose crowd of teenagers who spent their summers along the river, swimming, driving until the gas ran out, staying out past dark because there was nowhere else they'd rather be. She was loud, funny, and unafraid to say what she thought, partly thanks to 3 older brothers who had spent years testing her. What most retellings of this case leave out is the quieter side of her. Angie was nearly 6 feet tall and self-conscious about it in ways she rarely showed. She wore shoes a size too small just so her feet would look smaller, walking in discomfort every day to manage how strangers saw her. The confident girl the town remembered was also fighting a battle nobody could see. She graduated high school in 1995, worked steadily, and saved for a car of her own, a small act of independence that meant everything to her. Then, 3 weeks before her death, she took the next step, her own apartment on I Street, an older 2-story house near the river, not fancy, but hers. She had moved out after a disagreement with her mother, Carol, the ordinary friction between a mother who worries and a daughter proving she can handle life alone. The two hadn't spoken in weeks. Then, on the night of June 12, 1996, Angie came home. Mother and daughter talked, apologized, and made peace. It would be the last conversation they ever had. The next morning, Angie didn't show up for her shift. Calls from her boss went unanswered. Calls from her mother went unanswered. 2 coworkers drove to her apartment, climbed the stairs, and found the door unlocked. Inside, everything looked ordinary at first. Cups and an ashtray left out from friends who had visited the night before. Then they reached the bedroom. What they found there was the beginning of one of the most brutal, unsolved cold cases in Idaho's history. Angie had been the victim of a violent, sustained attack. There was no forced entry anywhere in the apartment, meaning she had either left her door unlocked or she had let her killer in herself, someone she recognized. Detectives working the scene collected something that would define the next 23 years of this case, a single, complete genetic profile. Blood, fingerprints, indeed good enough to identify one specific person to the exclusion of everyone else on Earth. For a police department built to handle a quiet town, this was uncharted territory. Investigators pursued leads within Angie's own social circle, the same river rat friend group she'd grown up with, running down alibis, checking timelines, testing whoever seemed plausible. Month after month, DNA swabs came back negative. 100 names checked, 100 exclusions. The department was under a kind of pressure it had never experienced, and the town was watching. Here's where you need to pay attention, because this is the part most retellings compress into a single sentence. The case wasn't cold because there was no evidence. It was cold because the evidence they had didn't match anyone they could find. And that gap between, we know exactly who did this, biologically, and we cannot name him, is what set the next 2 decades in motion. 6 months after Angie's murder, a phone call from Nevada brought in a name from her own friend group, a young man who had recently been arrested on an unrelated violent charge. He was tested, he didn't match, but in his interview, he mentioned a friend, 20-year-old Christopher Tapp. Tapp wasn't a suspect, he was barely a lead. And because he had a history of trusting the officers who once helped him as a teenager, he walked into that interview room without a lawyer and without fear. What followed, across 23 days and 9 separate interrogation sessions, is now studied by legal experts as a textbook case of false confession psychology. Investigators are legally permitted to lie to suspects, to claim evidence exists that doesn't, to imply friends have already confessed, to offer deals they may never honor. None of that is illegal. All of it was used. Tapp was polygraphed 7 times and told falsely that the machine could read guilt buried in his subconscious even if his conscious mind denied it. He was shown crime scene photographs, a decision later called indefensible by outside reviewers, because from that point forward, anything he said about the scene could have come from those photos rather than memory. He was threatened with the death penalty. Piece by piece, under sustained psychological pressure, Tapp produced a confession, one that shifted twice as his named accomplices were tested and excluded by the same DIA that never once implicated him. By January 1997, he was under arrest for rape and murder investigations tied to Angie's death. 6 days later, his own DIA results came back. Not a match, not close. Prosecutors moved forward anyway, building a theory around an unidentified third person Tapp was supposedly protecting. At trial in 1998, jurors never saw Tapp's earliest, unshaken denials. They saw only the later tapes, the ones recorded after weeks of pressure, where he echoed details investigators had already fed him. A witness later proven to have been coerced herself testified that she'd heard him confess at a party. The defense had science on its side. The prosecution had a taped confession and a courtroom. Science lost. Christopher Tapp was convicted and sentenced to 30 years to life. The sentencing judge said, on the record, that without the confession there would have been no conviction at all, an admission that the entire case rested on words extracted through coercion, not on the NIA sitting untouched in a case file. This is where the case most people know ends. A conviction, a verdict, a case closed. But that's exactly the part of the story you shouldn't trust. If you want to see how a single mother spent the next 2 decades unraveling it, hit subscribe now. New cold case investigations post every week. Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, didn't walk away after the verdict. She went back to the police station the next day and kept going back so often that officers started calling the entrance she used the Carol Door. For years, Carol built her own parallel investigation, flyers, a reward fund, late-night surveillance of possible suspects, hours spent reviewing 60 hours of interrogation footage on an old VS player. What she saw on those tapes eventually broke something loose in her. Christopher Tapp repeatedly getting basic facts of the crime wrong, only to be corrected by detectives in real time. A man who had confessed didn't know where the murder happened until he was told. Carol connected with Tapp's defense attorney and later with a false confession expert from Northwestern University's Center on Wrongful Convictions, who reviewed the full interrogation record and concluded in writing that whoever had actually killed Angie Dodge remained free. Carol pushed investigators toward technology that hadn't existed in 1996, familial DIA searching through public genealogy databases. A first attempt, using a commercial ancestry database, produced a partial match that pointed investigators toward an innocent filmmaker in New Orleans, 33 days of terror for a man with no connection to the crime before his DIA cleared him completely. It would have been reasonable to stop there. Carol didn't. She brought in a specialist in forensic genetic genealogy to work with the original, badly degraded 1996 sample, missing nearly 40% of its readable data, far below what's normally considered workable. The genealogist built out family trees from partial matches, tracing branches backward through generations and forward again, looking for a living descendant who fit the timeline. One lead, a distant relative in Twin Falls, was tested using DNA lifted from discarded chewing tobacco. Not a match, but a second database search surfaced a name that had been hiding in plain sight, a man who carried his stepfather's surname, severing the obvious genetic thread, but whose ancestry traced back through all 3 family branches the genealogist had mapped. His name was Brian Drips, and when investigators pulled the original 1996 case file, they found something no one had flagged in 23 years. A young officer had knocked on his door 5 days after the murder, standing directly across the street from Angie's apartment, asked a few routine questions and moved on. No DNA swab, no follow-up. Detectives couldn't approach Drips directly. This investigation had already produced 1 wrongful conviction and 1 wrongly accused innocent man. They needed his DNA without him knowing he was a suspect. Surveillance stretched across days, watching for anything discarded that could carry his cells. A cigarette butt, still burning when it hit the pavement, finally gave them a clean sample. The match was complete. Full genetic identity to the 1996 crime scene profile, to the exclusion of every other person on Earth. In 2019, Brian Drips confessed. Christopher Tapp was released and, later, formally exonerated. the conviction vacated entirely after roughly 2 decades behind bars. Idaho went on to pass a wrongful conviction compensation law, and TAP separately settled a civil suit against the city. But this is the part of the story that defines this channel's angle, and it's the part almost nobody tells. The ripple effect didn't stop at exoneration. Drips's guilty plea meant a second family absorbed the consequences of a crime they never asked to be connected to. A wife of decades, grandchildren, a name now permanently tied to Angie's murder. Carol Dodge, who had once wanted the death penalty for an innocent man, spent her final years of advocacy fighting for the wrongfully convicted instead, and later helped fund forensic technology for other cold cases through a non-profit built in her daughter's memory. And Christopher Tapp, given back a portion of the life that was taken from him, did not get to keep all of it. A truth this case still carries today. One confession destroyed a young man's 20s. One mother's refusal to accept a verdict, sustained for over 2 decades, is the only reason the truth surfaced at all. That is the ripple this case never stopped sending outward. Through a family, through a police department, and through the wrongful conviction laws Idaho passed because of it. This case is a reminder that a confession is not the same thing as the truth, and that the system built to find justice can, under enough pressure, manufacture the opposite of it. If this story moved you, subscribe to Ripple Effect Stories. Every week, we cover cold cases and unsolved cold cases where one decision created consequences that lasted for decades. Before you leave, type Angie's name in the comments. One comment, so she's not forgotten. 3 questions before you go. Do you think a confession should ever be enough to convict without physical evidence to back it up? What would you have done in Carol Dodge's position after the verdict came in? And if she had given up, if she had accepted that verdict and walked away, what does it tell you about a system that was never going to find the real answer on its own?